Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're floating gently into the sleepy chaos of 1945, that awkward, exhausted year when the world technically won a war, but didn't really feel like celebrating. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of something warm, non-radioactive, and preferably not rationed. Because tonight we're gliding through the strange calm after the storm. The moment humanity looked around and said, well, what now? The guns had finally gone quiet. Hitler was dead, in a bunker that smelled exactly as you'd imagine. Mussolini was also dead, in a far less glamorous setting involving angry Italians and a meat hook. And Japan? Well, Japan had just experienced two bright flashes of modern efficiency, courtesy of the atomic age. It was over. Sort of. Europe looked like someone had tried to run a continent through a blender and then gave up halfway. Entire cities had become abstract art installations made of rubble. Berlin was now a collection of broken bricks, occasionally held together by despair. Warsaw looked worse, which is saying something. London was a patchwork quilt of craters and stubborn optimism. And millions of people were moving. Refugees, prisoners, soldiers, the largest human migration in history. Families wandered across ruined railways with everything they owned in a single suitcase, looking for homes that no longer existed. You'd think after all that destruction, everyone might take a collective nap and agree to be nice. But no, because humans are allergic to peace. Let's float first to Europe. The exhausted, bombed-out center of civilization, or at least what was left of it. Britain technically won the war, though their victory party was slightly underwhelming, mainly because their empire was collapsing faster than a cheap tent in a hurricane. Londoners were still coughing up brick dust and making tea with water that had a suspiciously radioactive glow to it.
Living in half-destroyed neighborhoods, politely queuing for food that mostly consisted of cabbage and disappointment. Rationing continued well into the 1950s. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France was doing what France does best, trying to appear dignified after an embarrassing episode. Charles de Gaulle was strutting around Paris, insisting France had liberated itself, which is one of those statements you can only make if everyone politely agrees not to check the math. Germany, of course, had the biggest hangover of all. The country was split into occupation zones, like a giant post-war Airbnb managed by four landlords who didn't like each other. The Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets all carved up Germany, with Berlin awkwardly sitting inside the Soviet zone like a weird geopolitical nesting doll. The German people were starving, demoralized, and, in many cases, pretending not to have noticed that they'd been following an actual maniac for 12 years. But Reconstruction began almost immediately. The Marshall Plan hadn't started yet, but even so, there was this stubborn energy among survivors. Rebuild, somehow, even if it meant stacking bricks by candlelight. And over in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin was declaring victory with his usual blend of paranoia and mustache grease. The USSR had lost somewhere between 20 and 27 million people, which is the kind of statistic you don't even process, you just quietly stare at. Yet, despite the devastation, Stalin's regime emerged stronger than ever, because totalitarianism thrives on exhaustion. He began absorbing Eastern Europe like a man collecting suspicious souvenirs. Poland, Hungary, Romania, East Germany, each politely informed that they were now part of a friendly socialist family. Of course, this family came with barbed wire, censorship, and the occasional purge, but minor details. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic Ocean, were both horrified and thrilled. Horrified by communism, thrilled by capitalism. It was the beginning of that great geopolitical love-hate relationship we'd later call the Cold War, though at this point it was more of a lukewarm mutual distrust. Meanwhile, the United States had emerged almost suspiciously intact. No bombed cities, no ruined railways,
just booming factories, victory parades, and a sudden urge to tell everyone else how to rebuild their societies. The U.S. was now officially the world's biggest superpower, mostly because it still had running water, electricity, and optimism. Soldiers came home, went to college on the GI Bill, bought houses in suburbs, and started the baby boom. It was like the nation collectively decided to replace trauma with Tupperware. But underneath the cheerful consumerism, something else was stirring. That uneasy feeling that maybe this wasn't the end of war, just the start of a new kind. Nuclear weapons had changed the math. Humanity had invented something so powerful that everyone immediately agreed it must never be used again, while also frantically building more of them. Because logic. Let's drift east now, across the Pacific, where Japan was in ruins, literally and emotionally. 2 atomic bombings had flattened Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Tokyo looked like a charcoal sketch. The emperor, Hirohito, went from being a literal god to a constitutional figurehead almost overnight, under American supervision. General Douglas MacArthur, who always looked like he'd just won a personal war against fashion, became the de facto ruler of Japan. His mission was to rebuild the nation, rewrite its constitution, and make sure Japan never again got ideas about conquering half of Asia. The Japanese people, disciplined as ever, set about rebuilding their country from the ground up. Within a few decades, they'd go from devastation to economic miracle. But in 1945, the miracle hadn't started yet. Just a quiet, stunned silence, broken only by the sound of hammers and grief. Back in Asia, the old colonial powers were having identity crises. The British Empire was cracking like old paint. India was on the verge of independence, and the sun was very much setting on the empire where it supposedly never did. In 1947, India finally broke free, in the most British way possible, through paperwork, confusion, and mass migration. The partition of India and Pakistan created one of the largest human displacements in history, accompanied by horrific violence that nobody really planned for. The British politely packed their trunks and left, pretending it had all gone smoothly. Meanwhile, in China, the war against Japan had barely ended when a civil war resumed, because apparently peace was too mainstream. The Communists, led by Mao Zedong, eventually took over in 1949, sending Chiang Kai-shek and his government fleeing to Taiwan. And just like that, the world got another massive ideological split. Across the globe, something subtle but enormous was happening. Old empires were dying and new nations were being born. The 19th century's dream of global empires was over. What replaced it was a messy network of independent countries, superpowers, and bureaucratic optimism. The United Nations was founded in October 1945, the world's collective attempt at saying, okay, let's not do that again. The League of Nations had failed miserably, but the UN had fancier stationery and American funding, so people were hopeful. At first, it was mostly a debating club for victorious powers, but over time it became the global stage for, well, more debating. Still, it represented something new, a fragile belief that cooperation might work better than destruction. If you could zoom out from Earth in late 1945, you'd see a planet both broken and reborn. Ruins, yes, but also movement. Factories reopening, families reuniting, soldiers trading helmets for hammers. There was an almost meditative rhythm to it. Rebuilding, repairing, pretending things could be normal again. But under the quiet surface, history was already rearranging itself. 2 powers, the US and the Soviet Union, were circling each other like cats in a very expensive nuclear sandbox. Europe, too tired to care, was rebuilding its cities and its pride, quietly choosing sides in a world that was dividing again, just with different labels. And somewhere in all this, people were falling in love, having kids, writing letters, starting over, because that's what humans do, even when everything around them looks impossible. Let's pause here, in this half-ruined, half-hopeful world of 1945, where everything had changed, but no one yet knew just how much. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the early Cold War, the reconstruction of Europe, the rise of communism, the Red Scare, and the uneasy birth of the modern world. So stay cozy. We'll float there next.